So following on from yesterday's introduction to the different feminist forms and feminisms, how those correlated with each other, today I'm turning particularly to the form of realism from feminist perspectives, and in particular why in the period of second wave feminism that we were talking about yesterday there was a strong rejection of realism compared to the more recent 21st century landscape when there have been feminist revisitings and acceptances of realism. So this talk is mainly in two parts, but there's a bridging part. So the first part is dealing with the rejections. The bridging part is acknowledging that there might be possibilities of realism. And the third part is looking at the adoptions of realism. And that's where we'll look at the play that you've read in advance, Free Outgoing by Anupama Chandrasekhar, as a playwright who lives in Chennai but works theatre-wise in the UK. So that will form the second part and be one of our interactive moments this afternoon. Okay, so part one then. Here comes a revision point from yesterday. I said yesterday I'm trying not to leave anybody behind, and occasionally we'll repeat points so that by the end of the week these things have firmly embedded in your minds. So to recap on the matter of feminisms and forms that were introduced, firstly, the idea that feminism and forms were a matter of often fiercely heated debate when we were first engaging as feminist critics with theatre and trying to work out those pathways that weren't already mapped out. And we were relating our critical approaches to those three feminist dynamics, the liberal feminism, radical feminism, and socialist feminism as introduced yesterday. And as explained before, each of these feminist positions offered a different route to the notion of women's empowerment, from the bourgeois route, which was, as we said before, reformist rather than advocating the radical transformation of society, through radical feminism that posited patriarchal systems as its main issue, bone of contention, and socialist feminism that was pioneering ways of thinking not just about class from the socialist tradition, but finding a way to connect that with gender. And then we moved on to note how each of these feminisms was roughly, not strictly, but roughly relating to a particular set of aesthetics in theatre. We noted how realism was more likely to be found in the mainstream and with notions of liberal feminism, that radical feminism was drawn to the notion of ideas about a women's language in theatre, what that could possibly be, how could it make an appearance, is it possible at all? And socialist feminism that was allied and has the strongest tradition in the UK to presentational methods, and particularly Brechtian methods, which we'll do in detail later in the week when we have the session devoted to that particular form of feminism. So that's the recap. Now to the objections to realism. And these were energetically fierce objections at the time, and a matter of debate in terms of some feminists that kind of wanted to retain notions of realism, and a majority of us who had these very strong objections. So I'm going to try and explain why and what they were. And it was really to do, if we look at this slide now, about the way in which the bourgeois realist tradition was one that was othering women. We talked yesterday about women's position being othered rather than women being in a subject position, not the subject of the drama, the othered, the objectified, as we discussed it. And I included this quotation from the British playwright Carol Churchill, our leading contemporary British playwright, who once talked about the traditional structure of plays, and you can see the quotation there, the maleness of the traditional structure of plays, with conflict and building in a certain way to a climax, and with it combining an objectifying male gaze that shaped and controlled the performance space. So in turn, that was recognised as leaving very little room for the representation of women's experiences, making a women-centred stage. Somehow that conventional structure was deemed not to work, antithetical to the idea of creating the space, the stage space, as a women-centred space in which women could be the subjects, not the objects of the dramatic scene. So this is where these perceptions of realism were forged as it being a conservative, dramatic form, reflecting and reproducing or reinforcing dominant values. And I went back to explain this to you, I went back to Catherine Belser's work on classic realism. Because, shortly I explained that we actually, like feminisms, need to think of realism in the plural. But let's start with the form that we were objecting to, this notion of the traditional, the classic realism. And I've included a citation from Belser's Critical Practice there, published in 1980, where she explains how the work of ideology is to represent the position of the subject as fixed and unchangeable, an element in a given system of differences, which is human nature and the world of human experience, and to show possible action as an endless repetition of normal, familiar actions. That's the key thing there, to show possible action as an endless repetition of normal, familiar action. And in that way, and to this extent, the classic realist text performs this work and becomes an ideological practice. So the idea to hang on to there is this normal, familiar action. Its structure, narrative-wise, is one that leads to closure, not openness, closure. Representations of character, action, and narrative that attempt to fix the normal, not unfix it, change that we're looking at, no, to fix it as normal, familiar, in order to keep the status quo. You're not challenging the status quo, you're retaining it, you're reinforcing it, and you're reinforcing it through these closed narrative structures. So, in brief, realism's endless repetition of women fixed in dominant heteropatriarchal systems of representation were those that fueled our feminist objections. Now, I did say at the outset I wasn't going to make this too theory-laden in the week, but there are occasional points where some theoretical underpinnings are important, and this is one of them. Because to understand more about our objections to realism, as I've just explained through the kind of classic notion of realism, it's also important to understand what critical theoretical tools we had at the time that enabled us to understand the construction of the subject. And so to explain on this slide, and bear with me, it will become clear, I promise. In terms of theoretical underpinnings of understanding subjectivity, first of all, we had, at that time, okay, we've got our feminism in the frame, but we also, at this time, had semiotics, the pioneering of semiotics. So semiotics is understanding sign systems. So this is the era when we were first able to understand theatre as a sign system. We were no longer looking at what things mean, as we had done before in terms of literary approaches. In theatre, we could finally look at how things mean, through understanding it as a sign system, how meaning is constructed, through all the languages that theatre has at its disposal, whether it's lighting, costume, sound, actors' bodies, voices, movements, all of those complex languages that make up theatre as a sign system. Move that across in terms of semiotics, and you've got a way of understanding gender as a sign system. So that's where kind of feminist interests lie. And for feminist theatre interests, you've got understanding gender within theatre as a sign system. Remember that quote from Sue Ellen Case yesterday about how the female is constructed in the stage and othered. That all comes from understanding these as sign systems in operation within that framing. Alongside of that, we also had emerging understandings that come from psychoanalysis. So here we have feminism plus post-Lacanian psychoanalysis, the psychoanalysis that comes after Freud. I'll explain a bit more in a second. So from this, it was giving us an understanding in terms of subjectivity of how woman was understood as other. So if you put all those together, if you triangulate it, we had feminism and psychosemiotics. So we're drawing feminism, we're drawing from semiotics, and we're drawing from psychoanalysis. Oh, I'm seeing some nods. Good, I'm not totally losing it here. To put all that together to enable our understanding of subjectivity. So to flesh out the psychoanalysis point, as I said I would, feminism and Lacan. So this really did enable an understanding of how the human subject is constructed. And in terms of feminism, enable us to critique the construction of the feminine. Because what Lacan had as in terms of his, sorry, I keep losing this, in terms of his psychoanalytic methodology was an understanding again of language as a sign system, okay, which differed from Freud. It's language that makes the difference in terms of this psychoanalytical modeling. And I've included here that kind of famous reference to Lacan's mirror stage. So this idea that gets us to the split subject. So the human subject splits at the mirror stage, the point of entry to language. So there's the loss of the pre-Oedipal phase, the imaginary, the lack of the mother, through the entry into the symbolic order, the law of the father. So every subject splits through that entry into language, the loss, the lack that occurs of the pre-imaginary, through entry into the symbolic order, law of the father. If that is for some of you a bit much to take in, here is the key takeaway point on the next slide, the one to really remember. And this is about the idea of a double fracture in terms of understanding the female subject's position. This is the key one to hold on to. And I've turned back to Sue Ellen Case, who was introduced yesterday. And Sue Ellen's comment about understanding or expanding Lacan's metaphor in order to include the possibility of the female subject. Now, when the female subject splits, she sees in that mirror that she is a woman. And at that moment, she further fractures. So she splits once as the male identified subject and his subjectivity, and splits once more as the woman who observes her own subject position as both male identified and female. So it's double. Okay? This is the key takeaway point. So at this stage, to understand this feminist psychosemiotic analysis of subject formation is then to more fully understand these former feminist objections to realism, feminist resistance to realism's systems of narrative closure and its othering of women's subjectivity. I've extended the commentary there a little further with Catherine Belsey, noting how she also observes and summarizes that women's alienation as subjects in relation to the symbolic order creates this, what she's calling an absence, which feminism, when it refuses this liberal humanist mode of self-fulfillment, is able to appropriate, to take for her politics. To problematize the liberal humanist alliance with patriarchy, to formulate a sexual politics, is to begin the struggle for change. So we don't want to be stuck in those closed systems anymore. Don't want to be kind of stuck with this fractured, or we can appropriate that fractured split. We can acknowledge it. We can work with it. We can work in the absence. We don't want to be kind of shut off in a closed system, resigned and confined to those patriarchal systems. So, for feminist theatre practitioners, what this means in practice is a definite move away from realism, and instead the investigation of new forms, styles, in the interests of destabilizing, displacing, moving away from, contesting the dominant socio-symbolic order. We're wanted a way out of all of that, bottom line. To illustrate that, give an example, again, so it hopefully comes to make more sense than it might do in the initial, ooh, that's quite a lot to take in moment. I came up with this quotation, which is from Gillian Hanna, who was from Monstrous Regiment. If you remember yesterday, Monstrous Regiment, I said, has the best archive that you can find online to look up. So here's Gillian's reminiscence from that time, which relates to this idea of getting beyond realism. Rarely were we able to play women who lived on stage in their own right. We were always someone's wife, mother, or lover, someone being a man, of course. Our theatrical identity was usually defined in terms of our relationship to the more important male characters. We only had an existence at all because we were attached to a man. As Mary McCusker, who is another member, another monster, that's not a derogatory comment, that's what they called themselves. If you're going to be monsters, let's own it. So as Mary McCusker from the group was often heard to muse, if I have to play another tart with a heart of gold and a PV skirt, I'm going to throw up. Those were the roles they didn't want. So what that company's work exemplified was this, and they operate as a socialist feminist company always, were ways to break with realism, to rupture that form. And here again is Jill and Hannah talking about their experience of Carol Churchill's play Vinegar Tom from 1976. Vinegar Tom, if you don't know it, was a play about witches in which there are no witches. There are only women. Women who were perceived and punished as witches. But there, in the quotation there, you can see this explanation of having this series of quite naturalistic scenes, but these naturalistic scenes were punctuated by very modern songs in modern dress. And she explains how, well, if you took the music away, you'd fall back on something that started to look like a very traditional play. You'd be falling back maybe on something that started to look like that male structure, where it kind of moves in a linear way and closes everything off again, closes it down. So what she acknowledged was how they needed to have music there to smash that regular form, that acceptable dramatic form. She says they didn't sit down and make that decision deliberately, consciously, that they were going to smash that form, but it was kind of unconsciously felt that they needed to do that. As a feminist, she says, I think it also has to do with feeling that you are running, acting, moving counter to the prevailing culture, which I also think is an interesting observation, that like a gut response, that you're running, acting, moving counter to the prevailing culture, which is some of you practicing theatre may well identify with that feeling observation. So, another way to exemplify this move away from realism, beyond realism, comes from briefly thinking back to the rise of feminist performance art from this period, this second wave period. To remember this as a practice that clearly demonstrates resistance to objectification, to draw on yesterday's topic. Feminist performance art in this tradition negated the primacy of the dramatic text in favour of the body as text. So we're not dealing with a scripted realism at all anymore. We're turning to the female body to find our text in performance. I mean, again, it also links to this issue of objectification in terms of working with the female body, trying to work out what performance modes through working with the body could be resistant, or whether they still conformed some way, somehow, to an objectifying male gaze. As the feminist theatre scholar Rebecca Schneider expressed it, these feminist artists critiqued the idea that women were marked as given to be seen, but not as given to see. To be seen, but not to see, to not have that power to see. And so the bodies on stage, they become the canvas on which the script is written, or as she summarizes there, the historical drama of gender or race. So again, to illustrate this, the feminist performance art practice, and these observations here, I chose to bring into the frame Carolee Schneemann's very famous piece, Interior Scroll. There's a description of the performance there, in case this is unfamiliar to you. It took place between 1975 1977. There is no recording of the original. There's only, let me put the image up and then we can come back to the description. So there's just this image that remains of this performance. If we go back to the description, in the performance, Schneemann undresses, paints herself in large strokes, defining the contours of her body and face, and then reads from an earlier text as she adopts a series of life model action poses. Towards the end, she drops the book and begins to read the script from a scroll which she unravels from her vagina. So we look at the image again. The question then arises about how to read this image, and bearing in mind we only have the image that remains, not the actual performance. And what do we see from feminist perspectives? And this is where there isn't a kind of clear one way, yes, this is a very clear critique, escaping the gaze, or is it falling back into it? So that's why I put all of those with question marks on this slide. Whether it works as an effective feminist resistance to objectification, whether it possibly marks a rejection of the symbolic order in Lacanian terms that denies women a voice, denies their subjectivity. Is it possible to read interior knowledge as drawn from a female body and made visible? So I put them all with question marks. They're not definites, they're possibilities. Again, to amplify that, female body resisting the male gaze or recuperated by it? Is it deconstructive, potentially, or not? As Jill Dolan also asks, in a related way, is the female body still a sign which, when placed in representation, participates in a male-orientated signifying practice? Does it depend who's watching? I've always found, if I just flick back 1 second, I've always wanted to know who's holding that camera in the frame, which is kind of not knowing. It always makes me feel a bit uneasy. I'm not going to stop on this YouTube clip there, but there's a link there to Schneemann talking about the original performance and the spectators that were present, so you might want to have a listen to that. But she talks about it as being mixed, men and women in that audience, and having a mixed reaction. Some were enraged, she suggests, some were confused. Was this merely playing into old male fantasies? How to contextualize the work so that it does come across in the way that the artist would like. And if we're only left with a partial image of the performance, as I've stated, that seemingly makes our job harder in terms of trying to work out the particular feminist impact of this kind of work. But there's one message on the scroll, Schneemann explains, that is, be prepared to be misunderstood. And I think that's an important message. It's like, yeah, must make the work, but always be prepared to be misunderstood. I think it's an important feminist statement suggested there. So alongside of that, I wanted to just say a little bit about that. That's the professional work, and the professional work that was influencing the kind of work we were also making in university theatres at the time. So if you remember yesterday in the little introductory moment, I talked about how we needed to find ways of exploring feminist practice with students. So understanding it in a professional context is one thing. How we could draw on that and kind of explore what we could make together, what would count as a feminist practice, because at that point there were no feminist practices in the university theatres at all. Like I said yesterday, it's all male dominated. So we had to kind of work our way through from these theoretical understandings and professional work to what we could do in terms of making the practice feminist in working with students. So one of the things at the time was that we became very involved in devising work instead of working from scripts. We didn't abandon scripts altogether. Like I said, we were trying to recover as much women's theatre as we could from the past, or find it in the present and move it onto the curriculum. But there were very strong cultures of devising, and that is still the same today. And some university departments will specialise more in devising, some more in script work. Where I was based, it was more the kind of devising culture, how to make contemporary experimental performances was known as the Lancaster brand. But more specifically, from a feminist point of view, in terms of exploring those early practices, was, again, coming back to the body as text. Okay, what we could take from our own bodies, our own selves, our own subjectivities, and work from that into a feminist theatre practice. And that, for us, was an important way of countering this issue of everything being so male-dominated and canonical in terms of the curriculum that we had to deal with, including the realist tradition. You know, like I said yesterday, we had, 90% women on these courses, 10% men. So, you didn't want to be sort of always doing kind of plays where all the characters are men and the women might get to be a little servant in the corner. I'd put a note on there to remind myself to tell you that the gender reverses when it comes to drama schools after university. So where the universities have huge proportions of women compared to men, drama schools want men rather than women, which is a curious kind of pipeline moment. So it's much harder for women to get placed in drama schools to go on to train to become actors or directors or playwrights than it is men. There was one idea, and I'm going to give you some examples of the practice we actually did in a second, but there was one idea that also echoes this double fracturing point that I would say, when I was thinking about, this is the one that underpinned that practice at the time. And this is, this one comes from Teresa de Lauretis's Technologies of Gender from 1987. If I could just cite that for a moment. The subject, this is de Lauretis, the subject that I see emerging from current writings and debates within feminism is one that is at the same time inside and outside the ideology of gender, unconscious of being so, conscious of that twofold pull, of that division, that doubled vision. So again, it's echoing that idea of a double fracture, of a double vision, of being represented in one way, but knowing that's not us. We are not that. And this was one of the things that, working with students, we just kept constantly in mind. How we're represented in public discourse, and yet the sense we're not that. So we were playing at that split, in that schizophrenic split between represented one way and knowing absolutely no. So here, if that was the theoretical underpinning, here were some of the examples of what we did. So we worked extensively in workshops with Okay, I was trying to remember all these. It's quite a while ago. But we used to do a lot of work with magazines, that we'd bring in a whole pile of women's magazines. We'd make, if we had a room like this, we'd collage the whole room with the magazines, and then we will have our own bodies with the magazines and look at the dislocation, the inside and outside. We work between the two, and from that we might be able to then springboard and work from that into process to an actual kind of production or kind of small showing from that. We did a lot with clothes. The students would get them to bring in, your best outfit, your sleepy outfit, I've just been down the garden at whatever, and we'd have whole kind of piles of them. And then we'd work what happens to bodies in different outfits. The favourite was shoes. Shoes are fantastic for workshopping practices. You can have a kind of whole pile of them at the front of the stage. And again, what happens to your body if you've got heels, if you've got flats, if you've got trainers, if you've got no shoes? What happens to speech that goes with that? What happens to all the postures? And some kind of lovely, I suppose almost like Pina Bausch style, if you're familiar with Pina Bausch's work, choreographies that you can very quickly make out of that. The handbag exercise was always a favourite. There'd be one week where we all had to bring in handbags, and we'd empty the contents, and we'd make a big canvas on the floor, and we'd have stories with all the objects. And again, that sense, we might feel we shouldn't be wearing a lipstick, but here's the lipstick in the back, and that kind of split again. So summing up those techniques, it was femininity as masquerade, as I've put on the slide. We could masquerade it, we could mime it, we could perform it at the same time as knowing also we're not that. And later on, one other one I remembered, which was a favourite with the students, after Naomi Wolf published The Beauty Myth, there was a piece in there that gave me the idea of sending, so I'd have about 20 students, and I sent them all off to the beauty counters in local department stores, and they'd have to go and they'd have to perform as a customer that they wanted their skin checked or their eyes made up. And they would have to report back, so a reportage of how they were treated, how, what words were used to describe them and how they felt about it. And it'd come back, and then we'd kind of make pieces with that as well. Though I seem to remember that nearly every year one of the students would come back and say, oh yes, I bought this wonderful mascara. And I would say, no, that wasn't the point. You were supposed to go and then come back and we make something with the critical edge. You weren't supposed to succumb to it. Although they did actually, there was one little guerrilla tactic of my own that they all then adopted, which was, I said, had they ever noticed that when you go into these department stores and you go to women's clothing racks, it's really irritating because they always start by putting at the front the tiniest dress, and you're groping for the ones at the back. So I'd said I'd already adopted the practice of every time I'm in a store, I muddle them all up and make sure the big ones are definitely at the front, and they loved that idea. So I think my city's department stores for some time were plagued by our little rearrangements and scenarios at the beauty counters. It was fun, but it had an underlying significance to it. And summing that up, in 1999, this is the one book I wrote for the students, those students I worked with throughout the 90s decade. They used to come to me and say, to make a feminist practice, there aren't any books, Elaine, there aren't any resources, and there's only one of you and there's loads of us, and we just don't always know where to go and find ideas. So this one I wrote for the students in terms of putting all these various exercises together in one place. And the reason why I particularly want to show this is you can see from the cover image there the way in which that idea of the doubling, because for kind of that's one of my former students, and we had a phase of making these big puppets of ourselves that were based on our own bodies. So again, it was a doubling, and those bodies sometimes would have some of these artifacts on them. They might suddenly have shoes and clothes and pictures all over them. But again, you can see, just to finally underscore that point about the doubling, the being in and the being out, and the awareness of all of that. Okay, so that's enough on the feminist practice within the university circuit that's evolving alongside the professional practice at the time. So we move on. Does it leave any room for realism, given all that I've said, from the theoretical understandings through the alternative practices, like from feminist performance art, and what we were trying to do in the university? So this is the segue, really, to get us towards part two, towards the adoptions of realism. It's true, like I said at the outset, most of us were against realism, but there were some liberal feminists, as here I'm bringing Jill Dolan back again, that some liberal feminists and other women who were arguing against the need for establishing new dramatic forms, and therefore thought, well, there's nothing wrong with realism at all. And in the main, these were feminist historians who were looking back to other periods when realism had its uses. And that was an absolutely valid argument, that realism in the 19th century, yes, had its uses. It had its kind of moments of radical critique in terms of that particular social context. And in case anyone was interested in pursuing the idea of earlier possibilities of realism, I've also given you a reference point there to Patricia Schroeder's The Feminist Possibilities of Dramatic Realism, that's looking at the American context in the mid-20th century. But if we acknowledge that, yes, realisms in past contexts, past historical contexts have their uses, it does raise an attendant matter when it's a question of staging them, performing them. It's like, as I put it in feminist theatre practice, the realism might be in the past tense, but how do you make it in the present tense? How do you make it present? How do you make it speak to the contemporary if you look back to realism from the past? How do you make a play set in this past realism subversive in present time? So that comes back to issues of staging, how you put it together. In a UK context, do have to think about that, because realism is dominant still on the British stage. So activating a realist text from feminist perspectives is important to take on board. One strategy has been to adapt realist texts from the past. So not leave them as they were originally scripted, but take them and do something else with them. So the source text is there, but it becomes something different in the target text. So I give an example there of Ibsen's A Doll's House. How many of you know Doll's House? Oh, quite a few. Good, excellent. If you don't, I'm grossly oversimplifying now, but it's kind of domestic setup, and it's a woman who leaves her family being both husband and the two children that she has, and by the end of the play there's this famous, she goes out the door and the door shuts, so the door shuts on the doll's house. That's, I say, very oversimplified. That's all you need to know. And that is a play that's ubiquitously revived in the UK as well as many other countries. And it's one that feminists are drawn to adapting. I've given you one example there, which is a recent one from the Scottish playwright Steph Smith, which was back from 2019. And what she did was like, right, we're not having one Nora. Nora's the woman who leaves, shuts the door on the house. We're going to have three. One from the period of women's suffrage, one from the 1960s, and one that's contemporary. So she used that modelling, so if you know the play you can feel its resonance, but there you have got three Noras, different time periods, and then uses it as a vehicle to assess feminism through historical perspectives. So it's not staying with the original, it's adapting the original and making a feminist piece in that way. And this is where I wanted to show you this brief film, Nora, which is from 2012, which was made by the director Carrie Cracknell. And Cracknell at the time had a kind of revival of Doll's House on stage, but she also made this, it's really short, it's only 9 minutes, and we're going to watch it together, film called Nora, which is a contemporary response to the original. So I think we can look at that, and I have a kind of few of my prompt questions for you, and we can use that as a segue now, because in the second part, we're not looking at adaptations anymore, we're looking at new adoptions of realism. So let's look at this as the bridging moment, okay? Is that all right? I can see some nods. All right, now we have to see if the link will work. Actually, before I put it on, let me just show you the prompts, so you can be thinking about them rather than while it's played. So the prompts of these, remember, we're always thinking feminist, spectator as critic position. I'm probably in the way now. So the prompts I have is what this short film, which is adapted from this classic realist text, what does it reveal? How does this the combination of the visuals, the sound, the camera work? What kind of feminist textures can you feel, see in the piece? And then thinking about where we are now, contemporary feminist politics, any limitations that you see in terms of this piece that comes after Ibsen's Nora. Okay, so feminist textures, adaptation, how it resonates now. Those are the prompts. Okay. And apologies for any adverts that come up. They did earlier when I was trying it out. Oh, no. I thought it had. Yeah. I've saved it in... I thought it had. Yeah. Okay, just go directly into YouTube because I've saved... Yeah. Right. Okay, so go scroll it, push it back then. Yeah. Yeah, we'll go back. Yeah.
No, it's my husband's card, but we have a joint account.
He just called me this morning to say that his card...
No, I know it's a different account.
No, I know that. Hey, but, darling, can you pick up that box? No, I'm still here. No, we have a joint account, but that's not the card that's been... He'll be back tonight. Thank you. No, I don't mind if I hold. No, that's fine, I'll hold. All right. No, leave them, leave them.
Now hold on, just wait for me before we turn the corner. Oh, sorry. There we go.
Hello.
Have a good day. Say goodbye. Say goodbye. Bye to Mummy. Come on, give us a kiss. Bye to Mummy. Bye-bye. Bye, Mummy. See you later. Bye. Come on, Harry. Come on. Bye, Mummy. We're going to do some painting. Yeah. Get inside. Go inside.
Hi, Caroline, it's Nora. Hi, can you tell Neil that I'm just going to be 5 minutes late? Hello, everyone. I'm so sorry I'm late. Traffic this morning was hellish.
Really? Where was the problem?
I left a message. It's Caroline, actually.
My bad. Completely forgot to pass that one on.
Well, we've already kicked off.
Great.
Neil and I bumped into each other at Wentworth over the weekend. So I've already been given a heads up.
Great.
But why don't you start, Nora, and then Neil and I, we can jump in as and when.
Great. Where were we?
I think we'd better call it a day there. My daughter has a concert at 2.
Ah, how wonderful.
If only.
Oh dear. That bad, eh?
Extracurricular activities usually come under the jurisdiction of Miriam, but she's otherwise engaged, so I'm putting in a rare appearance.
I honestly wonder how you manage to fit it all in sometimes, Robin.
Sit down. Look at the book. Look at the elephant.
Rebecca, I am so sorry.
Come on, sit hello, you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, Heather.
Come on, darling. You made no noise. Let's go in ahead. We're going to the garden, yes, for tea. Very good. Yes, I'm coming, darling. I'm coming.
That's wonderful. I'm just going to go make a couple of quick phone calls, all right? Look. That's lovely, darling.
Hello? It's me. Nora?
I mean, you can, as per yesterday, raise on any other issues in relation to this as a performance piece, though. Okay, in relation to this, if there are other things you want to discuss.
With you or with my fellow mates?
No, with
I have a reflection, so I discuss with the class.
with the class, yeah.
Yeah.
When we get there. Let's ask him this bit of feedback here that I was just listening. Okay, so shh.
So we can see her that
Is it?
it's not working, is it? Okay, so we can see that when she enters her office, she, opens the door, or maybe it's the doll's house now. So she puts herself in the shoes of patriarchy, the red shoes, and she puts on the makeup, which it's sort of a patriarchal mask she's putting on her face, and now she's not the same person anymore. So, but when she comes home, she puts up her shoes of patriarchy, and immediately she contemplates her thoughts, and she looks at the colorful window. There's a window and it has a lot of colors. Maybe it depicts her own mind, but then her husband enters and all the colors are just gone. And yeah, so maybe her husband steals the colors of window, and now she's on her own feet, leaves the patriarchal ties.
Okay, that's great. I just loved the way they put it over here about stepping into the shoes of patriarchy. I thought that was a brilliant way of putting it, which is why I wanted you all to hear it. Okay, some other reflections from anywhere in the room now. And we have a mic for you.
Yeah. So I just want to put a theoretical underpinning in this movie. So just a documentary. So you said it, body as a text, and the psychoanalysis woman as other. So in the room when she enters, so it being treated as other. So the binary of that. And then Gender Trouble, 1989, the seminal work of Judith Butler. I would be wrong of date. So in that, so I just quoting, gender proves to be a performance that is constituting the identity it is purported to be. So in that second chapter, she says, Judith Butler, that act of performance is being done everyday performance, everyday experience. So, and then last quote, Simone de Beauvoir, one is not born, rather becomes a woman. So yeah, so that's I am putting. So all these texted, all these citation has been reflected in this documentary.
It's not a documentary, though. It's a creative piece. I just want to correct that.
Apologies.
Thank you. Okay. Well, Butler's ideas relate to the repetition of norms, and the repetition of norms enables the destabilizing of those norms. Okay. So I think it relates to the patriarchal shoes, putting them on, taking them off, but at that final moment, I'm not going to play this game anymore. Or maybe not, because it's left very open-ended, isn't it? You know, in the same way that the original was, or that big question mark that hangs there at the end, and when you step out the door, where is there to go? Where does she go? Which is also something, a motif that's inspired other kinds of adaptations over the years. Let's have one more reflection from in the room, because I know you're all chatting away, and then you can have your tea. Oh, yes, great. Hang on. Where's the mic gone? Oh, did you have another one? Oh, right, sorry. One there, and then the one from the back, and then tea.
Okay, so from what we discussed, in the original play in 1879, Nora had this longish monologue where she explained that how she has been a doll, she has been a puppet first in the hands of her father, in her father's house before getting married, and now at the hands of her husband. So now she needs to find herself, she needs to go on a journey of self-discovery. But here we do not have any explanations given. So the woman is now more unapologetic in that sense. There's no explanation required that why she, so to say, abandoned her house and left. So we were talking about the realist tradition, and one point of criticism that was there at that point of time against realism was that in order to portray the mundane reality of life, it somewhere ignores the psychological complexities of human nature. So somewhere this complexity comes across more in the movie than in the play, because here she doesn't give any explanations, things are more symbolic, and the presence of men in this movie is much less than it was in the play, because the husband was a constant presence, there was a constant dialogue that she had with the husband, and the husband only appears towards the end of the movie, only as a symbol to suggest that she's not there at home anymore. So he has been absent, whereas in the play he was constantly there.
Yeah, and I think, if I may, just to add on there, I think by making it, and there was discussion over this side, I know, about the husband being a kind of marginal figure, wasn't there? But I think what it does in a productively critical way is to take it away from the notion of like one individual man as a husband, to push it more towards the systemic nature of patriarchy, doesn't it? If you think about, I mean, that boardroom scene, with the guys there, and they've been playing golf, and they've been bonding, and oh my God, I've got to go to my daughter's concert, what a ball, all of that. So I think there's something contemporary there that kind of works. When I said before about looking for that, how do you get that critical edge? I think that's one of the successes in this thing, just to add on the back of that. Thank you very much. And then let's go back, and then, did you want to come in as well with something?
I mean, I just wanted to say that how the corporate like they said there, in terms of the corporate setup also, that's also bolstering the patriarchy, right? So you have this woman standing right beside the protagonist, and she's seeing that this woman is going through a lot. There's like, she's changing, but there's no sense of like, helping. Or in fact, there is this sense of like, oh my God, what a mess she is. And thank God that's none of us. So also those small markers of how those women are also not helping, because it's also the act of pitting women against each other, and how the ladder of patriarchy and corporate and
yeah, very good. There is that too, that kind of the top girl woman that kind of works within that system and then is letting others down. So again, we've got no sense of solidarity between women, have we? Great. And let's get this. Sorry to keep you waiting.
It's all right. Is it working? Okay. So to me, the scene where the protagonist Nora, and her hair flips like this, and it comes back during the play. It comes back multiple times, and to me, it hints at the stream of consciousness of Virginia Woolf, because at the end we see how in her pocket we find a doll, but to me it appears like a pebble. The way Virginia Woolf finally went to depression, and she ended her life due to depression, and it as if for me it seems like she doesn't have a room of her own, this Nora, this particular protagonist, and she finally takes the path of wolf. She stands by the waves in front of a sea or the wind. We can hear the sound of wind, and her hair flips. So I found it to be a bit symbolic to that. So my take is this.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
I agree. There is something of it's a very open ending, isn't it? It's open to interpretation, and I think you're right. There is a kind of depressive note in there. That kind of where do you go from here? And it comes back again to what we were saying before in the commentary in the slides about critical edges, and they're never hard and fast and fixed. They're open, and there are these possible readings, which we have to be aware of. But I do agree. There is that depressive note. I particularly appreciate the comment about the hair, because that's something I always notice. That thing, because it has a sense. Well, the body is a kind of weight, but there's something that's lifting. But where is it going to go? Which way is it going to go? Okay, thank you.
Similar comment about hair. Somebody has posted online as well.
Okay, did you want to just give us that, Kamita, and then?
So Venkateshwar is writing online that the repeated image of her hair in the wind is both a metaphor for her letting herself go and for a certain continuation of her embeddedness, which is like being caught in the wind, as it were. So it's a sort of a similar connection that he's trying to make.